So thank you all for joining us again. We will start with our welcoming remarks from our Finance and Operation Coordinator, Russell Franklin, who will give us an overview of today's session. But thank you all for joining, and over to you, Russell.
Good morning. Thank you, Siobhan. Good morning and welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us virtually for today's Compete Caribbean Plus call for innovative clusters. We appreciate your time and your interest and your continued commitment to strengthening private sector competitiveness across the Caribbean. Compete Caribbean is a regional private sector development initiative that supports productivity, innovation, and growth across Caribbean economies. The program works by financing and supporting initiatives that help firms collaborate more effectively, move up the value chains, and create better jobs and compete in regional and international markets. Traditionally, our cluster interventions have focused on well-established sectors in the region, such as agriculture, tourism, and services, where business models and value chains are relatively proven. This call is intentionally different. By opening the door to non-traditional and emerging sectors, this call embraces a more innovative and inherently riskier approach, one that encourages clusters to test new ideas, explore unfamiliar markets, and pursue future-focused opportunities where the development impact could be transformative for the region. We are especially grateful to our donors, the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office of the United Kingdom, the Government of Canada, and the Caribbean Development Bank for their continued support of Compete Caribbean. Their partnership is critical to calls like this, especially as it reflects a shared willingness to support well-designed, well-managed risk-taking to pilot new models, learn from implementation, and scale solutions that demonstrate real potential for competitiveness and resilience and inclusive growth in the Caribbean region. Through this call, we aim to increase competitiveness by strengthening supply chains, improving productivity, and unlocking new market opportunities. Mainstream climate action from competitiveness through green innovation, climate adaptability, and resource efficiency, and advance gender and diversity and inclusion by creating meaningful participation and benefits for underrepresented and vulnerable groups, including women and women-owned firms in the Caribbean. The cluster methodology we employ goes beyond isolated projects and emphasizes coordinated, market-driven interventions that strengthen linkages among firms, service providers, and institutions. Proposals are assessed with a strong focus on revenue generation and job creation, climate mainstreaming, gender diversity and inclusion, project feasibility, and sustainability and scalability. Today's webinar is designed to guide you through the application process in a clear and practical way, highlighting what the call is really looking for, common pitfalls to avoid, and best practices from previous experience. So, once again, welcome, and we look forward to your active participation today and to receive bold, innovative proposals that reflect both ambition and readiness to deliver results. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Russell. So we're ready to jump right in. For all of you who have joined us, thank you so much for joining us. If at any time there are any questions or any interventions, we invite you to ask the questions via the chat. And we also will open the floor for questions later in today's information session. But we will now move into the presentation itself. So I will turn it over to our pillar coordinator, Dario Pyle, to take us through today's information session. Over to you, Dario.
Thank you, Siobhan. Good morning, everyone, and welcome from me, the Pillar 1 coordinator, to this very exciting time for Compete Caribbean. As Russell, our finance coordinator, would have overviewed, we are a private sector development program, and Pillar 1 of our program, which I have the privilege of leading, is focused on our support to private sector firms and improving competitiveness, climate action, and inclusion. So looking at this cluster call, the first thing I wanted to do is gain a baseline understanding across all of the participants. And I think it's very, very important for us to have a common understanding of what innovation is. When we speak to innovation, what do we mean? And in this instance, what we're talking about is novelty or improvement that significantly differs from what it replaces, and importantly, has been made available to potential users. So that's where creation and commercialization come together. And there are two main types of innovation. The first one is product innovation, and that speaks to actual creation of goods or services. And there's also process innovation, which is inward looking, and that looks at business functions. So you can take the approach of looking at an outward market focus or looking inward at your business operations. Now, an innovation cluster in particular is focused on fostering and accelerating commercialized innovation. So what that means is creating new knowledge that can spill over into all of the interconnected entities within the cluster by blending the research and talent and capital, importantly, to boost competitiveness, economic growth, and resilience. So why are we focusing on innovation at Compete Caribbean? The first main motivating factor is that the Caribbean lags in global innovation benchmarks. So these markers, such as the Global Innovation Index and IP registrations, we are lagging behind. However, it's not due to an absence of innovative capacity. Instead, there's a need for formal vehicles and technical assistance support that can allow innovators to formally enter markets. And that's where this call for proposals comes in. Further, research has shown that innovative firms achieve significantly stronger progress and performance across productivity, sales, and other key important metrics for firms. And this is in comparison to non-innovative firms. In terms of the research source there, it is the IDB Innovation Firm Performance and Gender Survey. The data set is available on the Compete Caribbean website if you'd like to take a deeper look. And then ultimately, as Russell would have mentioned, we're very interested in driving diversification beyond traditional sectors to build more resilience and nurturing some growth potential that exists. So what is the call process? For those that are unfamiliar with Compete, we always start with a call for proposals, which we would have launched last week for this call. At the close of the call, there's a shortlisting process where a number of clusters are selected for technical assistance to expand their proposals into a full cluster development plan. And the cluster development plan will outline all of the details and specifics around what the cluster proposes to do. Following the development of that plan, all clusters will be required to present their cluster development plan to an independent investment panel. And this is a mechanism through which Compete receives independent recommendations on which clusters should receive the grant funding for implementation. So that's the process map we will go through over the coming months for this call. So why are we issuing the call at this time? We have a strong focus on clustering to support the delivery of collective and public goods. And importantly here, this is where firms can solve problems that are too great to be resolved at the firm level and instead require collaboration for resolution. Equally, it could also be to pursue opportunities. We're looking at how we can help firms to build scaled economies and scope economies that can allow them to overcome the challenges related to small firm size, small markets in the Caribbean, high fixed costs, and gain some of those benefits that you can get from scale economies. Environmental sustainability is critical for us. For Compete Caribbean Plus, it is a theme that runs through all of our programming. Climate action is critical for all of the interventions we design and support. So it's important that the clustering initiative integrates these methodologies and thinking throughout all of the structure and design rather than being an add-on afterthought. And then finally, we want to facilitate green innovation and growth. So unlocking the potential to fulfill the unmet demand that exists within this region. So what would make a compelling proposal? There's something called the innovation sweet spot that the ideal proposal should seek to meet. And that is, it should have a clear, desirable solution where there's demand evidence among customers for this novelty or improvement. It should be feasible. So it should be built on the strengths of capabilities. So this is not a point for blue sky thinking. It needs to be real and grounded in the realities and capabilities of the partners in the cluster. And then finally, it needs to be profitable. So it needs to have a scalable business model that is sustainable even after the funding from Compete Caribbean ends. So looking specifically at the proposals we would hope to see coming out of this call, the first major component is collective action on a problem and or opportunity. So as I said, the proposal can be focused on tackling some challenge, some shared challenge that a number of firms in a sector or within a value chain face, or it can be some market opportunity that exists that one firm alone cannot effectively pursue. So that's why the clustering methodology is essential to benefit from the opportunity. Secondly, there should be an innovation and competitiveness agenda. So again, this goes back to that innovation sweet spot where the proposal should demonstrate how this specific innovation that's being proposed ties back to the problem or opportunity that is being pursued. And further, how the implementation of it will enhance the competitiveness, sales, create jobs, or boost exports for members of the cluster. And I would note here that we are sector agnostic for this call, so there are no specific stipulations around the sector of focus. We intentionally left it open for firms to demonstrate where these opportunities exist. So in thinking about your innovation and competitiveness agenda, it's very important to bring to bear desirability, feasibility, and profitability. Thirdly, climate action. So the proposal should clearly show how the activities will enhance climate adaptability or increase resource efficiency. And this is something you need to think clearly about from inception so that it's reflected throughout the full spirit of the application rather than being something where you check multiple boxes at the end trying to make it fit. So if it only fits within one specific area of the application, it's better to highlight those one or two areas rather than trying to check all of the boxes to say you cover things that it really feasibly cannot and does not fit within the scope of the project. And then finally, gender diversity and inclusion. So we are very focused on enhancing meaningful participation opportunities for underrepresented groups. So who is eligible to apply? Now, this call is open to all 13 countries that Compete Caribbean covers. And you can see them on the slide, you can see them on our website. I won't run through each one now, but you can find the information on the call webpage. In terms of cluster members, we're very flexible on this. It can be private sector firms, business support organizations, research and academic institutions, non-governmental organizations, and also trade and investment authorities. Now, important to note here is that because this is an innovation call, and a lot of the capacities around innovation are very dependent on research, we strongly encourage collaboration with research institutions, academic institutions, to get the backing needed to make robust and feasible proposals. Now, there's some key requirements to be mindful of with the clustering applications. The first thing is that there must be a minimum of 3 private sector firms within the cluster from eligible countries. So the cluster should be constituted with at least 3 firms from any of the 13 countries that we're covering with this call. Yes, firms from countries outside of the 13 countries can be part of the cluster as well, provided that you satisfy the minimum of 3 with registration from an eligible country. The second requirement is that there must be a lead entity, and that lead entity should be a private sector firm, because for innovation to meet the commercialization aspects, there must be a path to market. And importantly here, regarding the private sector firms, they should have legal constitution. So that means it can be a registered business name, it can be an incorporated firm, but it should have legal constitution. The cluster should be committed to collaborating on the methodology. This process will require time and commitment and dedication. The cluster development plan process typically takes around 3 months, and technical assistance will be provided to support you going through that process, but it still requires a lot of effort on the part of the cluster members. And as I mentioned before, yes, non-Caribbean firms and entities can participate, just provided that you satisfy that minimum of 3 private sector firms. So what are the awards coming out of this grant call? The first thing is technical assistance. So clusters that are shortlisted from the call for proposals will receive technical assistance to support them in expanding the proposal into a cluster development plan. And that can include technical advice and guidance on the best path forward with the proposed problem or opportunity, and also actual assistance with writing the cluster development plan. So it will be the responsibility of the consulting firm that we hire to provide this technical assistance to actually write the plan, but the cluster needs to provide all of the information required. And then secondly, at the point of the investment panel, depending on the recommendations made, clusters will be able to access grant funds for technical assistance up to US $350,000. Now, there's some requirements regarding the grant in particular. The first thing is that the process for compete will require the hiring of a cluster manager. This is mandatory for the implementation of the project. So this is only for the clusters that are selected for implementation. They will be required out of the budget of $350,000 to hire a cluster manager. And you will see it already entered into this annex for the budget. That spreadsheet will have a line for the cluster manager and a budgeted amount that you cannot change. Secondly, clusters are required to provide counterpart contributions that are valued at 20% of the project budget. So the Compete Caribbean grant will fund a maximum of 80% of the project budget, and the cluster is required to provide 20% of the budget. And of that 20% is broken down into in cash and in kind contributions. And as I mentioned before, the clusters must commit to this 3-month process of developing the CDP. So what are the evaluation criteria for this call? The first major component is innovation enhancement. It's an innovation call. So we are very focused on looking at where the innovation exists, whether it's within the firm or within the market, so internal or external, and the degree of innovation or novelty. Is it incremental, radical, or disruptive to the market? That is 25% of the evaluation. Secondly, technical and operational feasibility. So as I mentioned, we're not focused on blue sky thinking at this point. It needs to be real, it needs to be feasible, and it needs to be something that the cluster has the capacity to do with the partners and cluster members that are involved. And I will note here that you can have core cluster members that may be private sector firms, and you can have a partner that could be a technical guide or input that can support on the technical components of the project. This component would be worth 20%. There's a third component on economic impact, and that looks at revenue, exports, job creation, those types of metrics. That is also worth 20%. Sustainability and scaling potential is 15%. Mainstreaming climate action for competitiveness is also 15%. So that's where you align climate action with the economic objectives of the project. So if you want to increase your productivity, how are you doing that in a climate smart way? So it should be integrated through the thinking of the activities and approach to the project, not an afterthought. And finally, gender diversity and inclusion at 5%. So does the activity benefit diverse or vulnerable groups within the sector or wider community? So taking a look at the budget, as I mentioned, the Compete grant is 350,000. That's a maximum amount. You are free to apply for less, so any amount up to that cap. The in-kind cluster contribution, this is based on the maximum grant. It would be a minimum of 87,500. However, this would adjust down if you're applying for less. So if you apply for 300,000, it would always work out to being the 80-20 split with 10% across counterpart contribution in kind and 10% across the in cash contributions. Some important things to note regarding the counterpart contributions. They should demonstrate additionality. So meaning these should be activities that would not have taken place without the project specifically. And they can include equipment and facilities that are provided for the implementation of the project. It can also include operational costs tied to project implementation, as well as staff time allocated to supporting the project. So an important thing to note regarding the eligible expenses for the project, the Compete grant does not cover capital goods or operational costs. These are ineligible for the Compete grant. Instead, the eligible expenses are things like research. So it could be a feasibility study, a baseline study, market research. It could be technical assistance in the area of process or product development. It can be product and service quality and design improvement, as well as certification schemes, action plans, training and education. Those types of activities can be part of the budget. So I'll pause here because I've shared a lot of information for any questions.
Just one question, Dario, which is from Christopher Durrell asking, how is the cluster manager selected?
That's a good question. So once the cluster is recommended for funding by the investment panel, the project becomes an IDB implemented project. And what that means is we handle the administration of the funds, and therefore all procurements for the projects are done through the IDB system. So what we would do is collaborate with the cluster on the TOR. So you would have the opportunity to input into the specifics around what types of duties and assistance would be required. And this is beyond the scope of the project. The cluster manager is for any procurement under the project. We would collaborate on the TOR. And once that is finalized, the process goes forward through the IDB system. And it would be put out to a procurement through our IDB procurement system, which is open to firms that are IDB members. And we can do a firm or an individual consultant. And once the opportunity is posted, you are free to take that link and share it with anyone within your network. However, the procurement and selection would be managed through the IDB process. Sorry, reading the chat. So when we say technical assistance, can you choose your own vendors? No, it goes through the IDB procurement process. So it wouldn't be selecting your own vendors, but you are free to share the opportunity with them and have them apply. Does the cluster have a say in who the cluster manager will be? The input is through the TOR. So how we design the TOR, you can influence how it's structured, but the selection is done through the IDB process. What is the IP protection for innovators during the call? So we are governed by IDB's data protection policies, and the intellectual property rights for something that is conceptualized within the cluster would belong to the cluster. However, if it's the result directly of IDB support or intervention, then there would be a specific agreement that would be outlined in the terms of the contract. One selected applicant or a pool of applicants will benefit from this opportunity. So it's going to be a pool of clusters. We don't have a specific number outlined because it depends on the number of proposals we get. It is a competitive process. So it isn't that we are limiting per se, but it is dependent on the number of applications, how they're scored, and the capacity for the firm that we hire to provide that support. Can a regional body be the cluster lead? Could you provide further information on what you mean by regional body? Is it a private sector firm? The lead entity needs to be a private sector firm. However, the regional body, I suspect, can be a cluster member or a partner of the cluster. Are innovations in government administration eligible? Yes, if the government is the customer. Yes. And the government entity could be, say it's a state-owned entity that you're partnering with, they could be a member of the cluster as well, but they can't be the lead firm. And that would be set up like a value chain. So they would just be the customer that is integrated into the project. The eligibility is tied to 3 private sector firms. Is it accurate to assume that nonprofits do not count towards eligibility, but may be optionally included? So nonprofits can be cluster members, yes. In terms of private sector firm eligibility, not necessarily. Russell, I don't know if you want to weigh in on that.
I think you kind of answered it, 'cause I was responding to Miss King here. So I think the eligibility, the most important thing about eligibility is that it must have 3 private sector Caribbean firms from our 13 participating countries.
Correct.
After that, you can have BSOs, you can have other regional institutions. So in the past, for example, ICA or FAO have supported clusters that had the minimum of 3 private sector firms. As Dario said, because this is a very innovative cluster, you can have 3 Caribbean private sector firms as the basis. But if you wanted to bring in international firm to support, that is also possible too as well. But the important requirement is it must have 3 Caribbean firms in the cluster itself.
Thanks, Russell. So what you can do is add some more partners and you would be covered. For NGOs, how long should they be registered? We don't have a specific duration or minimum lifetime requirement, but you need to be registered. Can a member of the cluster also be the cluster manager? No. It needs to be an independent individual. Can a government entity be part of the cluster? Yes. Can you elaborate on the list? The eligible expenses for the grant once more. Apologies. Yes. So going back, in terms of the eligible expenses, this is a technical assistance grant. So use that to frame how you approach it. Capital goods, meaning we can't purchase items, or management costs, operating costs can't be included or dedicated for the grant funds, but technical assistance support can be. So that runs the gambit of, as I said, research. It could be direct technical assistance. Say you need an expert to come in to support on the service quality improvement, design improvement, for example, quality systems, certification, developing an action plan, any of those types of activities. How many clusters will be rewarded? So at each point, the number will become less. So for the shortlisting, we will shortlist based on the scoring and evaluation. So it isn't that we have a set number per se, but we're aiming at least to have 4 or 5 clusters. And then at the point of the grant, that is dependent on the recommendations of the investment panel. So there is a pool of funding, yes, dedicated. However, say there are 3 clusters that are recommended for funding. It depends on the budgets of the specific projects, how far the pool of funding will stretch. So we can't say beforehand with authority. Did you correctly say that the lead entity being a private sector firm? Yes, the lead entity must be a private sector firm. What's the minimum number of entities that have to be included to be considered a cluster? 3 private sector firms. I see Russell answered. Private sector firms, or can it be NGOs? NGOs can be cluster members, yes, but you still need to have the minimum of 3. So we would need government entity and another 3, yes. So regardless of the constitution of membership, you need to have 3 private sector firms. And private sector firm, that requirement does not spread across a government entity or an NGO. You need to have the firms, and then you can have any other cluster members accordingly. There's no minimum grant amount that you can apply for. So you can apply for anywhere between $1 and the 350,000, but I'd be very interested to see what you can do with $1. How is the funding dispersed and the execution timeline? Good question. So again, it's going to be an IDB implemented project, which means we handle the procurements, we handle the disbursements of funds. So the funds would go directly from IDB to the vendors on the specific project activities. And execution timeline is 24 months. So the project should be scoped within a 24-month or 2-year period. And yes, as Russell said, it can go up to 36 months, but we aim for 24. Must all firms be from different countries? No. Thank you, Zara. Can we match the 10% cash? Okay, thank you, Russell.
I assume that's the question the person was asking, if it had to be
Like actual US.
Yeah,
No,
actual
yeah,
US.
exactly.
No, it doesn't. It doesn't have to be actual US. Yeah,
Because you would, especially if you're spending it locally on
exactly.
local activities, yeah.
Exactly.
Okay, so I'm going to pass now to Zara to run us through the application process and examples of some cluster projects. However, please continue inputting your questions in the chat, and the team will type the responses, or Zara at the end as well has a Q&A session for her segment to answer any questions directly. So I'm happy to hand you over to Zara Allen, our Project Development Officer with Compete Caribbean. Over to you, Zara.
Thanks, Dario. Happy to be here this morning. And yes, as you mentioned, I see that we still have some, especially eligibility regarding to firm eligibility questions in the chat. So we can always get to that as well. We have a question and answer segment after this portion, but this part will focus more on the how, right? So up to now, what we're trying to bring together is what CC Plus is looking for, how those proposals are assessed, and then what strong cluster projects actually look like in practice. So yes, obviously, considering the eligibility criteria is very important. That will let you know whether it makes sense to submit an application, but also hopefully this section will help you to understand kind of what those strong cluster projects could actually look like. So everything I'll cover, which would be the application steps, the annexes, and the examples, should be understood through one core principle, right? So strong cluster proposals start with a deep understanding of the customer problem being solved. So innovation is only compelling in this case if it clearly solves a real external customer problem. So not just a coordination or efficiency problem inside the cluster, right? So from an evaluation and investment perspective, CC Plus is not funding collaboration or clustering just for its own sake. It's funding innovations that customers can value, adopt, and pay for, and that clusters are uniquely positioned to deliver. So CC Plus is funding clusters because collective action allows firms to solve external market-facing customer problems in a more competitive, scalable, and sustainable way. So, sorry, lost my. So as we go through the application process, I encourage you to constantly ask yourself, sort of, is this solving a real external customer problem or mainly an internal coordination issue within the cluster? Because the clusters exist to solve the market problems through that collective action. So the internal cluster challenges are really only relevant if they clearly explain why customers are currently underserved and why firms can't solve this problem alone. So thinking about that distinction is critical, and it affects how your proposal will be scored. So strong proposals will always start with a clearly articulated customer problem, a clear explanation of why the market opportunity exists, and then a demonstration that collective action enables a solution that individual firms cannot deliver alone, right? So let's move into the actual application process. So the application form is really, one way to think about it is it's a proposal, right? So those who are evaluating the applications are not going to infer your intent or your context or any internal discussions, right? If it's not clearly stated in the form, it won't be scored. So you should really treat every section of the form as an opportunity to demonstrate your market relevance, your innovation clarity, feasibility, and business logic, right? The application will focus heavily on, and we encourage you to focus and really think about the problem and opportunity. So that's the core emphasis, and it's one of the most important parts of the entire application. So a common weakness that we've seen in proposals is that sometimes they describe a cluster problem rather than framing it within a customer or a market, a customer problem or a market opportunity. So they may focus on saying, for example, our firms are too small. We have a lack of coordination, limited technology, high operating costs, and these are true, but on their own, they're not in that investable problems, right? So strong applications, we hope, would clearly explain not only what the problem is, but who the customer is, right? What problem that customer is facing, what problem is the cluster solving for them, why the problem matters, why the current solutions are inadequate, and why a cluster specifically is uniquely positioned to solve it. So you should think about how to explicitly link those internal cluster constraints to external customer pain points as well and market opportunities. And then one thing to also consider, now I know that we've spoken a little bit about why innovation is important and how this particular call focuses on innovation. But one thing to remember is that innovation does not necessarily have to be radical or very high tech, but it has to be an explicit, novel, and defensible innovation, right? So your strong innovation descriptions should explain what is new or significantly improved from the customer's perspective. And this speaks to, so you may be aware, for example, that there are two parallel calls that are open right now for clusters. And one is geographically specific. One is open only for 6 OECS countries and Belize. And that is specifically to address a lack of applications from those countries. And we want to be able to support clusters in those countries. This is open to any eligible clusters from all 13 countries. And this focuses specifically on the innovation aspect. So this is focusing not only on supporting technical assistance for a collective action problem. This is for a group of firms that is specifically looking at introducing a novel idea, So something which is, you have to explain sort of what is new, what's being significantly improved, and then speak to why that requires collective action. So in what way will collective action help to make that innovation stronger? And then also think about how the innovation changes the business, right? So it's not only from a technology perspective or a product, it could also be from a process perspective. So how does it change the way in which the business runs? Does it change your cost structure? Your access to markets is an important one. Customer behavior, for example, increased sales. So we're not really only asking if this is new for you as a cluster or a group of firms. It's also, is this meaningfully different for the market? How does it create value for the market, right? Why does this change customer behavior? How does it change their willingness to pay or the competitiveness? And why does collaboration specifically make this innovation possible in a way that firms could not manage alone? That part's important. Why couldn't a firm do it alone? And this aligns directly with what Dario was mentioning with the desirability test and innovation assessment, right? So are you solving a problem that customers truly care about and not just something that is interesting internally? When we're looking at expected results and sustainability, this is also a part you'll see in the application. And the reason I'm jumping around is because my colleague Ibrahim is going to walk through the application in greater detail so you can actually see the questions and the way that they'll be answered. But what we're trying to give you as an overall approach in terms of how this can be assessed, right? So the results that you should consider, because the results, you'll need to be explicit results that we can tie to this investment on this grant investment. So the results need to be credible, right? And they need to be clearly linked to solving a customer problem. And they matter because they demonstrate that solving the customer problem actually translate into the business outcomes, whether that's sales, exports, productivity, increased productivity, jobs. So sustainability in this case is not only about good intentions, it's also about answering a simple question, which is, if the customers value the solution, or if this is a credible solution, why would it stop after the CC plus funding ends? So the question of what happens after the CC plus funding is important because it demonstrates that within the cluster, there's the capacity to continue the solution beyond the life of the grant. So the strong applications will show how that customer demand, the revenue, whether it's membership fees, contract, cost savings, allow the customer to continue and to scale. So when you're thinking about results, think about not just intentions, but about the business logic. How is solving this problem going to lead to those increased sales, productivity, resilience? Have the assumptions grounded in market logic. We understand that you may not have available data because this is also available for clusters that are just starting up. So you may not have the data, and we understand that, but we would like you to give a range, give an idea, and especially when you're giving if you're giving a range, think about the assumptions that would be guiding that estimate in terms of your expected results, right? So show why the customers will continue to demand the solution, and then how the model can be either replicated or expanded or continued. So now we'll move a little bit into the annexes. So the annexes is really where you can show what your cluster can actually deliver, that you can deliver what the narrative and the application promises, right? So think of it as sort of the proof that your understanding of the customer problem is real, that your understanding of how the problem will be solved is real, and that you can actually deliver that solution. So there'll be the Annex 1, which is on activities and budget. And that one, you'll just show a clear solution between the customer problem and the innovation, the activities, and the budget. So you'll show your activities are clearly justified by market needs, and then an estimated budget that reflects priorities, right? So think less about generic activities and think more about how the activities actually lead to the results that you're projecting. So once again, just a reminder, when you're going through this section, CC Plus on Compete Caribbean plus grants fund technical assistance. So can't be capital expenditure, can't be routine operational costs, no goods, no works unless there's a specific um, that's the no capital goods and works. So some equipment, but it would have to be in a very specific circumstances. The Annex 2, which covers the member information and the baseline. So this is really a way to show also, think about it as well as demonstrating capacity. So does the cluster have the right mix of capabilities for what it's proposing to do? Technical, commercial operations. Do members have the credible roles? And where baseline data is available, is it strong enough to measure impact? Where it's not available, is there an explanation for how it would be gathered, right? You don't need to have perfect data. We understand that that's a challenge, especially in the Caribbean region, but what we need to see is a serious commitment to tracking results. And then the letters of commitment. These are not just symbolic and procedural, it's also important because they signal a certain seriousness, alignment, and shared risk among the cluster members. Clustering is hard. Clusters, one of the key challenges to be able to build trust and work together. You're oftentimes working with people who are either within your industry already, who you may have been previous competitors with. And so building that trust is important, and signaling how you plan to work together is also important. So in those letters, you would also be specifying the cash and in-kind contributions, and it would be nice to see what the concrete role as well for the member is. And then just remember that the submission deadline is June 3rd, 2026. Applications must be submitted completely, submitted on time, submitted online. If you run into challenges, please do contact us, but we cannot accept late submissions or incomplete submissions. Okay, so right before we wrap up and move on to the application, I just wanted to spend a little time going over what strong proposals look like in practice. We'll look at one previous cluster example and then some potential examples, but please do not feel limited by this. What this is really looking to highlight is why certain examples resonate with Compete and what we're trying to achieve. So as Dario mentioned, we're sector agnostic. Across sectors, strong clusters share one thing, right? They start with a clearly articulated customer problem, and then they have an innovation which is clearly designed to address that. So across all the strong cluster examples, you will see that there are three elements. A clearly articulated customer problem, a well-defined innovation, and a credible pathway to scale and sustainability. One of the examples that we came up with was Caribbean SaaS cluster. So the technical strengths there would be clear innovation, right? Subscription-based digital tools adapted to a regional reality, strong competitiveness logic, which would look at productivity gains in certain traditional sectors, and then built-in scalability. And so the core problem is not that software firms necessarily need collaboration, but it's that businesses in traditional sectors struggle with inefficient operations, weak supply chain coordination, poor data availability and visibility. So the cluster could exist because no single firm could efficiently design, test, and scale those tools alone. So that's an example. Another example could be, for example, battery storage and microgrid solutions, right? So in this case, we're looking at strong alignment between climate resilience and competitiveness. And then the customer problem would be vulnerability to climate shocks. But climate action in this case, for example, is not just an add-on. It directly addresses business continuity and resilience, which customers are willing to pay for. In this case, though, remember that we wouldn't be able to invest, for example, in the actual goods, but you could look at the way in which the company is structured and strengthen the cluster in its ability to deliver. And one actual example, which Compete has supported in the past, was the Jamaica Castor Bean cluster. So in this case, we were working with the University of the West Indies at Mona. And the real customer problem, one of the customer problems, I should say, is that buyers couldn't verify quality or origin. So it limited access to certain premium markets. And then so the innovation was really to focus on scientific standards, traceability, and certification, which directly solve that customer trust problem, enabled certain access to other markets and pricing, and then also focused again on long-term sustainability and scalability. So it's research-driven innovation, some academia industry collaboration, which has its own specificities which would need to be considered in terms of ownership of IP and how that research can be used. And then also a clear sort of export and scaling logic tied to certain geographic indicators. So it's something to think about. Although there are specific challenges and specific issues that would need to be addressed in any cluster, and it's important, it would be good for you to think about how that would be structured and what some of the risks and mitigation strategies would be. So the same logic that applies in these could apply, for example, in energy efficiency clusters, digital adoption clusters, as a waste to value value chain. So the strongest proposals will link climate action, technology adoption to concrete customer benefits, lower costs, improved reliability, regulatory compliance, access to new markets, instead of treating those climate actions or technology adoptions as sort of standalone objectives. So we know that in small island economies, the focus is often on knowledge diffusion, adoption, and market relevance, and that's particularly powerful when it comes as well to feasibility. So overall, just to reiterate, solve real customer problems, use innovation to remove and show how innovation is being used to remove some of those market bottlenecks, and then leverage collective action to scale your solutions. Because scaling, especially in small island economies, often comes from replication, standardization, and diffusion. So it's not only about adding more firms, for example, but also about solving the customer problem in new or larger markets. So that is it for my section. I will now open for questions. I assume we have a lot still to answer. I'll turn it back over to Siobhan or Dario in the meantime.
Thanks so much, Sarah. So we're going to jump to our walkthrough because we've been doing a rolling question and answer segment. So please just utilize the chat. And just to reinforce, as Sarah said, we are sector agnostic and open to products and services. So I'm going to hand you over now to Project Development Officer Ibrahim Abdullah to do a demonstration of the application process, just to show you the platform, how to access, and I believe he's prepared a dummy example for us all to enjoy. So over to you, Ibra.
All right, thank you very much, Dario. Let me find my screen to share. I hope this is the right one. One second. Can you see my screen? Am I sharing?
Yes.
Go ahead.
Okay, and is it large enough?
Russell, you're our resident eye checker, but yes, it's good on my end.
All right, good. So good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining this application clinic. We're very happy to present our call for proposals. My job today is to give you the confidence that you can do it and that your cluster idea that is in your mind, that you're probably already working with, is possible, it is feasible, and it may be exactly what we are looking for. So that would be my first pro tip, just to be confident that what you have is what we would be looking for. Secondly, I would like to start just by I'm showing here this link that I have from my email, which is my draft application. And I will show you how this application is actually retrieved from a previous example I would have worked on and makes us able to then use this as a tool to collaborate with our various cluster members and to work on the application in more than one sitting. So as I have clicked the link, it has brought up my application, and we will now go through that application. I will show you more or less how that link is generated. First, we start with the general information on the call and important definitions, more or less a glossary to help you understand some of the terms that you would have seen in reading maybe the call documents. So let's start. This is the cloud button that you click in order to create more or less a backup of your application. When you hit this link, the email link, you can email it to as many of your cluster team members, including yourself, which would be useful in the case where you have that true collaboration where you are reviewing the cluster submission as a team and able to help each other on the changes required. So for today, I've also created an imaginary cluster, which is to help us to understand the understanding, to help us to understand the cluster methodology and help us to understand what we would be looking for in the form. So the name of our cluster is the Diaspora Nexus. It's a data-driven e-commerce cluster and green logistics hub. And it is, as you would have seen in our spreadsheet, it is related to the sector ICT and digital technologies. And the relevant subsector would be e-commerce. This basic information, as you can tell, is really to give us a general understanding of what the cluster is about and who would be our key contacts, etc., for the cluster. Here we have an example of what really describes the cluster, whether it's a horizontal collaboration, vertical collaboration, or conglomerate. And for that, I think it's really important that you really understand where your cluster is and the stage you are in your development. So our cluster is a high-end, we are doing high-end artisanal lifestyle products. So we are doing organic and handmade products such as soaps, ethical and cultural fashion, wellness, combined with smart global freight forwarding, digital product tracking, and data-driven fulfillment services. Our cluster is in a potential stage. So we are gathering as a team and we are thinking about how we propose this cluster to Compete Caribbean. So we are not in the existing stage, we are in the potential stage. And our innovation is a process. So our process, which we are creating, is a new digital brand that would be available to customers. And this will describe how this process is innovative and why it meets the needs of this call. So the name of the lead firm is Ship Caribbean Digital Logistics Limited, and our country of registration is Jamaica, which is an eligible country for this call, as all of the Compete Caribbean countries are. The name of our president is here, Marcus Mosiah, and the name of our main contact is Robert Nesta. His title is Director of Supply Chain Innovation. We have the telephone contacts, emails, and the organization's website. If you think like an evaluator, I may be curious about this organization, or I may be curious about the cluster, and I could be encouraged by what I see on a firm's website. Moving into the cluster call itself, what we want to do in this first section is to identify what is the main constraint or problem or opportunity affecting your cluster's innovation, competitiveness and resilience. And these could include various examples you would have seen here, as well as in the guidelines document. I just want to pause to say, that it's really important to read the guidelines. A lot of what I will go through today is more or less in the guidelines. So I think as you develop the concept, it should be that constant back and forth between checking the guidelines for our criteria or examples and moving back and forth in between that and the form. So what we want in this section is really what is the specific global market opportunity your firm is trying to capture, what is the constraint we are collaborating to overcome, and how are we uniquely poised to solve this constraint, and how will solving this impact the wider economic potential of the cluster. So for our Diaspora Logistics Hub, we have created a figure. You should not create a figure. You should have it based in research that there's $18 billion in unfulfilled direct-to-consumer market for Caribbean lifestyle products among the diaspora, and that MSMEs are completely locked out of this because of the prohibitive individual and shipping costs, and that they also lack data to understand what diaspora consumers want before they produce it. So this would be important for us as we create later on the justification for that CDP, or as Dario mentioned, moving towards IDB-funded technical cooperation. So be very intentional about the application form, because it will, I would say more or less 80% of it will survive all the way through to your technical cooperation project. So cluster and importance. So you have to explain why this challenge or opportunity cannot be addressed by individual firms acting alone, and how collaboration and innovation changes the focus on the outcomes to create better solutions. So what we want here, we want to understand why this must be done together, who brings what to the table, why is 1 + 1 + 1 greater than 3, and how are we better, stronger, and more productive together through scaled and reduce costs. For example, a single artisan creating, soaps, shampoos, lemongrass, mists, and so on, why they can't be competitive. They can't be competitive on their own or secure competitive global freight rates. They can't afford maybe smart forecasting software. And by clustering 5 MSMEs, while having a lead tech firm that provides digital logistics, this collective action could allow us to consolidate shipments / shipping costs and enable a competitive 2-day delivery to our key markets. So that section more or less would help us to understand what is the innovation. And then we have every section is not tied to the criteria, but I think these first 2 questions that we have dealt with would really help us to understand both the innovation and the feasibility of the cluster that we will be proposing. So we have the proposed cluster solution, and we are asking here to describe the collaborative solution and highlight the major activities involved. So we want you to focus on maybe 3 or 4 game-changing actions, collective actions that you will apply the grant to. What are the practical steps to build this innovation, and how will you allocate the available budget of this call? So that available budget is $350,000. And I think this really says that we want to ensure that what we are proposing can be achievable. From the Compete Caribbean side, we also are very proud of our clusters and want them to succeed. So I think it is in everyone's best interest to have a cluster solution that is able to be implemented within the budget and to be successful with that given budget. Again, a reminder that Compete Caribbean's funding is technical assistance, and as Zara explained, any equipment, it should be zero. Very minimal. Maybe you have to have a computer to run the digital tracking system for our example. But we definitely are a technical assistance-based project, and I would say any deviation from that will not be very helpful in the application. So for our example, we are developing a shared e-commerce platform that uses data and analytics to track diaspora demand trends, and we will allow MSMEs to manufacture exactly what we will sell. It also tells us what Compete Caribbean's technical assistance will do. We'll pay for the software development and integration of the digital origin passport, which I think personalizes the product and lets those diaspora buyers understand who is the artisan creating that product. We also have logistics optimization consulting included. So moving on to key stakeholders, and again, we don't have a one-to-one match, but for me, key stakeholders helps us to judge your how innovative you are, how feasible, and how sustainable this cluster could be. So we want you here to list the 3+ private sector firms, their operational roles, also to include any enablers, technical agencies, universities, government agencies, and this would be your preliminary stakeholder map. So for our example, we are saying that Ship Caribe is the lead tech firm, and our core members are legally registered artisanal MSMEs who will supply the physical products and input their origin data. And we'll also cooperate with the Jamaica Business Development Corporation as the BSO to provide export certification and training. So again, what this shows is it shows us that the example will be feasible in terms of being able to be implemented within the given budget, and it has the right partners already on board that gives it the best chance of success. For risks, risks is important. I would say don't be afraid of mentioning risk. What we want here is more or less what are the financial, technical, or market disruptions that could derail the project. And my pro tip is to show how your project design or cluster characteristics actively mitigate these risks. For the risk structure, we should use the structure of identifying the risk, stating its impact on success, and then what the mitigation action was that would be taken. So for example, we can imagine this situation where we have rural partner MSMEs and they have a bit of digital friction entering inventory into the platform. The impact on our success is that the incomplete inventory visibility can cause shipping delays and lost sales. And our mitigation action is that we will design a simplified mobile-first app-based intake and utilize the Compete Caribbean funds to hire a dedicated change management trainer for the first 6 months of implementation. So again, very practical and able to be implemented feasibly. So moving to climate action, I think this section is where you can gain up to 15%. And I think it's not going to be a given away. I think you have to earn it by more or less stating and being very clear and realistic about how this application or how this concept is related to building resilience and reducing the climate vulnerability of the firms. So for us, in our example, we have identified emissions reduction, circular economy. Maybe we have some upcycling also included in terms of the MSMEs. We have green goods and services. And we should support this. We have the available space to give a strong supporting statement. If relevant, relate to your national targets and NDCs, NAPs, any regional policy ideas related to climate change and resilience, and state how the cluster, the these characteristics relates to the resilience of this cluster and leads to long-term viability and success. Next, we want to understand how the proposed solution will address climate risks or opportunities. And here we are really asking, what are the main risks that makes your products or sales vulnerable? How does your green innovation integrate into your business model? And we really want to connect resilience directly to improve profits or cost reduction or long-term viability. So for our example, we have used the individual air freighting of a single artisan, creating massive carbon emissions and is highly vulnerable to fuel price shocks. We are stating that we have the abilities to forecast demand and utilize green freight to ensure that we decarbonize the value chain and protect profit margins. And additionally, we have a shared procurement policy for the cluster where we'll use 100% biodegradable packaging and eliminate single-use plastics from the export cycle. So we now move on to gender, diversity, and inclusion. And for this one, I would remind you that even though it's 5% of the scoring criteria, that this is a very competitive call. And 5% can be the difference between having your CDP funded and getting very close. So what we want to understand here, which are the underrepresented groups are relevant to your sector or cluster, and how does the proposed initiative intend to include or benefit them? So what we want here, we want to know who are the underrepresented demographics involved, how does your core business model financially or operationally benefit them, and how does this inclusion strengthen overall project outcomes or sustainability? For example, very real example, it could be that the artisanal sector is over 75% women-led, and they are currently excluded from high-margin exports due to the technical and logistical barriers. And this project directly integrates these female-owned MSMEs into highly lucrative, tech-enabled direct-to-consumer pipeline that increase their take-home revenues and also improves their digital literacy. So again, be very clear in how you think about how your cluster is impacting on inclusion of vulnerable groups. For the expected results, we have our economic impact criteria, which is 20%. And I think a lot of that 20% would be earned here, where we briefly expect you to describe the expected results, being quantitative and qualitative. And our tips here are to use SMART indicators, and you want to provide achievable, quantifiable targets that prove the economic impact or viability of the cluster. We want you to be realistic based on the operational capabilities of your cluster and the budget available for this call. And as Zara said, while we don't expect complete data, there should be solid numbers with solid justification as well that we can build upon. And for our imaginary cluster, we have one new process. We have our increase of sales of 150% within 24 months. We want to also have cost reductions, and we want to improve or expand the number of export markets. If you think this looks a little bit like what would be in a results matrix, you are correct. And what we eventually would have when we complete the CDP is a clear articulation of what the results to be achieved by the cluster would be. So lastly, we would like to finish with sustainability. And we all know the value of sustainability. How is the proposed collaborative initiative expected to continue after Compete Caribbean support ends? And what we want here really is to understand how will you pay the bills in year 3 and beyond? What happens when our grant ends? And we want to see an ongoing revenue model where the cluster can generate its own funds to pay for shared assets, including maybe a continued recruitment of a cluster manager beyond the compete grant, and how it can survive the next 10 years without subsidies. I say 10 years, but for the foreseeable future without ongoing subsidies. In our example, we have that once the platform is built, we will have a transaction fee model, a 5% logistics and software maintenance fee levied on each diaspora purchase, and this permanent revenue stream being able to pay for server and management costs, while still maintaining the profit margins of the MSMEs that they save on individual shipping expenses. So we've come to the end of the application form, and I think some things that are not in the application form, but which sort of come through as an evaluator reading them, things like commitment, purpose, leadership, how you create that sort of excitement among evaluators would be important. I would say read the guidelines very thoroughly when you've completed your application, to go through it and score yourself against the evaluation criteria. Maybe have other members of the cluster collectively score the application against the criteria and identify any areas where it could be stronger. And if you have the time, and I think it would be worth it, it would be important to look through some of the literature generated on clusters and value chains by Compete Caribbean and also by agencies like UNIDO. So thank you very much, and I'll pass back to Dario to complete and wrap up the session.
Thanks so much, Ibra. So just to reinforce on the application process, you can save your progress and revisit it later by using the small cloud icon at the top right of the screen. And just to remind you in terms of how you structure the project and design within the confines of the regulations for the call, you can always allocate the procurements that you need to do for capital goods, equipment, those that works, any types of activities like that into the beneficiary or counterpart contribution components of the project, and have that count as both your in-cash and in-kind contribution, depending on how you structure it. So just to wrap up very quickly, what we are going to review is the timeline and the next steps. So right now, we are at the point of our first information session. The call would have been launched on the 22nd of April. The next information session is going to be on May 13th, and we're going to treat that as an application clinic of sorts. So that's where you can come and ask questions around how you structure. You can get some feedback, and it's an opportunity to refine your approach and get some initial feedback. Really want to highlight the deadline to submit the proposals, which would be June 3rd. So please try as best as you can to get those applications in before the deadline. And it would be close of business on June 3rd. I think we may be able to stretch it to midnight, but absolutely cut off on June 3rd. So please ensure you have the submission in. We expect to announce the selected concept notes in early July. So just a 1-month turnaround to notify the clusters that have been shortlisted. And then the process of technical assistance for developing the cluster development plan will take place over the course of July to September, that 3-month period. Within that period, there is likely going to be a mission to your cluster. So it's where the consultants and representatives of Compete will come on the ground and visit to have, usually it's either at the beginning of the process or in validating the cluster development plan. So you will get some on-the-ground support as well. And the investment panel is tentatively scheduled to take place in November. So that would follow completion of the cluster development plan. The panel is a one-day event, so you would either fly into Barbados, where potentially exploring and support would be provided for if you're required to come to Barbados to present. But we're exploring if we can do it virtually, given that it's an innovative call. We need to use the technologies available to us. And the announcement would come within 2 to 3 weeks of the one-day panel event. So you should know by early December what the recommendations and outcomes are from the investment panel. It's a really good opportunity to get some technical feedback from experts. They provide not just scores, but also justifications and rationales around where the strengths and weaknesses in the project are and how those can be improved upon. An important question was asked in the chat around the grant amount. So just to say, we as Compete may not unilaterally change the grant amount that's allocated to you. However, the investment panel can make recommendations on partial scope implementations. So perhaps they've reviewed the project, they feel that it is strong, but there's a component that does not align, is not as robust. They may make the recommendation that that component is not funded, and therefore the grant would be adjusted. So that is at the discretion of the panel. There are instances as well, say the pool of funding, we've done the allocations based on the recommendations, and there are additional funds that we're able to mobilize. We may then be able to give a partial scope grant offer on some additional clusters, but again, that's dependent on how the process goes. The last thing to say is in terms of evaluation criteria, those will be consistent throughout the process. So the same criteria we went through today will be used by the investment panel to evaluate the project as well. And ultimately, following the recommendation by the investment panel, we would go through the process of turning this into a formal IDB project, which requires some documentation, some internal processing steps that we would walk the project through. And that brings us to the close of today's session. Thank you guys so much for joining us. We're looking forward to seeing the exciting proposals that you come up with for this initiative. And I'll hand you back over to our host, Siobhan, to close us out.
Thank you so very much, everyone, for all of your questions and your engaged participation today. We recognize that the process for applying for these grants and just to ensure that you have the best possible outcome. So our session today was the first. We will have another session to do another deep dive in the application process, and any persons who would like to have any additional clarification just before the deadline, we will share the link for the upcoming session, plus today's recording and the presentations with you, or the email address that you would have used to register today. We also have all information available on the call page on our website, as well as any other open calls that might be of interest to you. We leave you today thanking you for your attention, wishing you the best of luck, and please remember to get your application in before the closing date of June 3rd. And we also invite you to join us for our next application session on May 16th. Thank you all, and looking forward to seeing all of your applications. Best of luck to you. Bye, everyone.